What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we'll be taking a look at this farmhouse style bench. Now this bench has turned legs from Carolina Leg Company. You've seen me use these legs a lot in some of my other videos, so you know that I definitely like these legs. Now the cool thing about this bench is that all the joinery is Mortise Tenon Joinery. So other than the tabletop fasteners, this bench is made with absolutely no screws, no nails, or no hardware. Everything on this bench is wood. So in this video I'll take you through all the steps of how I made this bench so that you can make it for yourself. I've also got a link to the dimensions and all the tools I used in this video in the description, so check that out if you want to build this for yourself. Alright, let's get into it. So in a lot of my previous videos you've seen me use this K4 jig to cut pocket holes on the apron like this. So you drill in here, then you put pocket holes, and then those pocket holes can join the apron to the leg like this. Now that works fine, but sometimes this can wobble a little bit that way, so that's not what we want. So that's why I want to try mortise and tenon on this build. So the first thing I need to do is cut the mortises in these legs. So I'm going to use this spiral upcut bit, and I'm going to plunge in this way with my router and then cut upward. So I'll plunge in about 1.5 inches this way and then go up or down whichever way the bit sets. And then I'll do the same thing on this side. So I'll plunge in and cut up. Then I can put a tenon from the apron going in here and that way. So the first thing that I needed to do was to set the router up. So I put the 1/2 inch router collet in, and then I put the spiral upcut bit in and attached that. Now the spiral upcut bit works really well for this. If you're interested in that spiral upcut bit, the router, or any of the other tools that I'm using in this video, you can check out the description where I'll have a link to each one of these products as well as the dimensions that I used if you would like to build this table for yourself. So I attached 2 edge guides to my router. This is the easiest way that I've found this to be done. However, you do not need a fancy router or 2 edge guides. You can use any router with a single edge guide and get the same results. So I put all of the legs together and then marked the top in order for me to know the position of each of the legs. So as I cut the mortises, the orientation of the leg will flip from side to side, which you'll see here in a minute. So I used a scrap board to mark where the center of the apron would go. Now the position of the apron doesn't necessarily matter, but you'll want to mark a line with a straight edge so that when you put the router on, you can see where the bit is supposed to set. So I put the router on, and then I was able to adjust each edge guide in order to make sure that that bit did line up in the center of this. So when the bit is relatively close to the center, everything on the edge guides can be tightened down. Now the cool thing about using these edge guides is that every single time it'll line up in the same spot on the leg, so you don't have to worry about adjusting that each time. So I'm using a 3-inch apron and I wanted a 2-inch tenon, so I marked lines at 3 inches, 2.5 inches, and 1/2 inch to recess the tenon 1/2 inch from each side of the apron. This will make a lot more sense here in a minute. So I'll usually do this cut in multiple passes, but I'll start on one line and then cut all the way to the other line, and that'll give me a perfect 2-inch tenon down the original line that I marked. I cut just a little bit further than I should have on this, but this is the main idea, and this is how I'll cut all the mortises out for these. Here's a closer look at the mortise that I cut, and then on this side, so I'm cutting the mortise on the other side, you'll notice that I flipped the leg backwards. So earlier the bottom of the leg was facing towards the left of the screen, but now it's facing towards the right of the screens, which will keep the apron in the right side on each spot. So when I talked about flipping the orientation of the legs earlier, this is what I was talking about. So normally I'll line the bit up perfectly on one line, cut a hole, and then I'll cut the hole on the other side. So here's what it looks like. This way it's just a little bit easier to cut the mortises accurately rather than trying to guess and stop them. It can be a little bit difficult to see with the dust collection on this, so that's another reason why cutting the holes first makes it a whole lot easier when cutting this out. It's also less stressful on the router, and you can tell when the bit is finally at the end when it slows down and slips into that hole that you've already cut. Again, here's a closer look at the mortises, so whenever we cut the tenons, they will fit right down in there perfectly. So here's a zoomed out look where you can see me do the complete process all at once. So I'll normally cut the bottom hole, the top hole, and then I'll slide the router back, cut one pass, slide it back again, and cut the full deep pass. So usually I'll take 1 inch out on the first pass and then the full 2 inches on the second pass. Now this might look a little complicated at first, and it does take a minute or two to set up, but once you've done this a couple times, it's actually pretty easy, and I strongly prefer this to pocket holes if I'm able to take the time to do that. And with the mortises cut in each leg, it was then time to move on to making the aprons. So I made the apron from regular 2x4s, so I'm just cross-cutting everything to length here. I cross-cut 2 long aprons, 2 short aprons, and then 2 inner support pieces. And each of these pieces would be milled up on the table saw. So I first adjusted the blade to where it shaved just one side off and completely flat, and then ran all the boards through the table saw to match up on one side. So it would be better to use a joiner here, which would give you a true flat surface, but I can do this pretty well on the table saw. At the time I'm making this video, I don't have a joiner, so this was close enough for me and this worked out pretty well. After I had one flat side on each of the boards, I moved the fence in just a little and ripped the other side. This would give me a nice milled up shape of each of the pieces. I ended up cutting each of these to a 3-inch height, and these are used for the aprons. So you notice here that I have 2 long aprons, 2 short aprons, and then those middle support pieces, which you'll see those used here later in the video. So after each piece of the edge was cleaned up on all of my apron pieces, next I ran them through the planer a couple times on each surface. This is really to just get the rough edges and some of the cut marks off of these boards, not really planing them down to a certain thickness, just trying to clean them up, which will give it a better look whenever they're assembled. Next I put the dado blade on my table saw, and then I use this to cut a small detailed groove on each piece of the apron. This isn't at all necessary, I just think that this looks cool on the apron and it makes it stand out a little bit more when it's finished all together. In the past I would use a router table to make this cut before I had a table saw that could hold a dado blade. So there's multiple ways to do this. You could do this on a router table or with a handheld router as well. So to cut the tenons on each piece of the apron, I used the dado stack that was already on my table saw. So since I cut the mortises 2 inches deep earlier, I moved the fence 2 inches away from the front end of the blade, and then this would leave me with the exact depth of the mortises that I cut earlier. I also left the thickness of the tenon the same width as the mortise that I cut earlier so that it would fit down in perfectly after I had the sides rounded over. This does take a few minutes to get everything measured and set up properly that this will match up, but it works out really well and it's a pretty easy process using the miter gauge on the table saw. So here's how they line up, and you'll notice that I have the classic problem of fitting a square peg into a round hole. So I used the sander to round the edges over. Now looking back, I wish I would have used a chisel for this. This kind of left the inner corners sanded down not quite as well as the outside edges, but in the end it did end up working out. Next, I dry fit everything together to make sure that all of my mortises and tenons were cut out to the proper size and dimensions. It kind of seems contradictory that we're going to put everything together and then take it back apart for the final glue up, but if you have any pieces that do not fit together, it's going to be much easier to correct them before you have glue all over everything. So I dry fit the entire thing together. You see here that I had to sand down a little bit on one of the tenons. And then on both of the long pieces of the apron, I cut a groove on each side using the dado blade that was already in there. So these will be where the support pieces go of those extra apron pieces that we cut earlier. You'll see how these come together here in a little bit further along in the video. To keep each groove consistent and in line with the other grooves, I use the fence on the table saw as a gauge to mark off of how far I should cut on each piece. Here's a quick look at each groove, and then with that we can finally get to the assembly part of these. So the assembly is pretty simple. You just put a little bit of glue down in the mortises and then slide the tenons into place. I did put enough glue to where these would hold secure, but you don't want to fill these up to where there's so much glue in there, because when you put the tenon in, there's nowhere for the glue to go. So it'll either prevent the tenon from going in all the way, or it'll come out on the sides and you'll get glue everywhere, which will show on the finish, especially if you're using stain rather than paint. So I put the small apron pieces in first, then the longer apron pieces. This was just a little bit easier for me to get everything together this way. One thing you may notice is that I did use clamps to kind of squeeze these together all the way before finally clamping them up permanently. So I used the small clamps to get them together, and then I used the big pipe clamps to keep everything in place. One thing to remember when you're putting clamps on is to check the squareness of each corner and each angle. You want these to set square. If there's any skew to that, it will throw it off. You may be able to see that at the end. So to put the inner support braces in between this table, I'm cutting another tenon not quite as long, but this will fit down in similarly to how the mortises and the tenons went together. If you're wondering why there is a dado groove on the inside of this support piece, well, that's because when I cut the dados originally, I got the support pieces and the smaller apron pieces mixed up. But if we're just quiet and we don't tell anybody about that, then nobody will ever know. Except for everyone, because I just told you. So let's pretend that I didn't tell you and you never saw what I just pointed out. Now that you forgot about that part, this is what the final glue up looked like. So I left the clamps on for about a day, and then it was time to move on to the bench top. For the top, I used a 2x10x10. I first cross-cut this in half. Apparently I didn't record that part. But I do have two boards the size of what you're seeing here, so I used my track saw to rip a perfectly flat edge on one side of each of the boards. These would be glued together for the join up. Now at the time of this video that I'm filming, I did not have a jointer, so this was my preferred method. This works really well and it does give a nice seam, but this takes a while to set up. After the middle seam on each of the bench top boards were ripped, I put out some big bar clamps and then put the boards on top. So here's the seam that I was talking about. It really is a nice fitting seam and it does turn out really well with the track saw. As I mentioned, it just takes a little bit longer to set up than I would like. However, using the track saw has been a good way for me to get good results with this. So to join these together, I just use glue and then I put the seams together. Now a lot of my previous videos, I would use dowels and you can also use biscuits for this. I don't think that that's completely necessary, but there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. Whenever I do clamp something up, I'll use claws to clamp them flat, assuming that my workbench is flat. Then whenever they're clamped down, I'll actually tighten up the main clamps holding them together. So here you can see that I'm clamping the claws down to match up the profile to my bench. Then after they're flat, I'll go back and tighten the main bar clamps that are holding the boards together for the main glue up. Here's what everything looked like when the glue up was finished. And then similarly to earlier with the mortise and tenon glue ups, I left these clamps on for about 24 hours, a day or so, and then I took everything off assuming that it was completely dry. Now my glue ups for the most part turn out pretty flat and they're not too bad overall, but I do take down any ledges with the hand plane, so I just ran across the top with the hand plane mainly to get this smoothed out and to get any misfit of that middle seam taken off first. After I hand plane the surface down about the best I can, I sand everything down starting with 80 grit, working my way all the way up to 120 grit. Once I have the top surface roughly sanded down, I use my track saw to flush cut each end and cut it to length. So if you don't have a track saw, you can do the exact same thing with a circular saw or even a jigsaw. If you don't have either one of those, you could always just cut the two boards to the exact same length and you would get a similar result by gluing them up that way. So before I had the top completely finished, I used some Starbond to fill in the cracks in the top. These are pine boards, which are notorious for having some knots. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I just did a separate video on using Starbond to fill in gaps. The Starbond hardens quickly and then it can be sanded out. So I took everything down to 220 after I sanded that. And then it was time to trim the edges up using a roundover bit on my router. So this will give a little detail and make the bench top look a whole lot better overall. Here's what the roundover bit looks like up close, and I would say that roundovering a top is definitely one of my favorite parts of detailing something that I'm finishing up on, which is always followed by my least favorite part of finishing up, which is sanding. But I did use the sander again to get any marks out left by the router whenever. Don't forget to get the edges on those because they will show, and then it was time to stain the top. Staining isn't too exciting, so not a whole lot of detail here. I use espresso stain, and my one tip would be go with the grain whenever you're trying to stain something. So once the stain is dry, you can then put clear coat. I use gloss polyurethane for this. Now normally I'll let the stain dry for 2 or 3 days. I got busy with around 100 or so things, so this is about a month later. I think the stain was finally dry at that point, so I just brushed the polyurethane on top. I let the clear coat dry for a day or so, and then I gently sanded it down with 400 grit, so you want to use very light pressure, just enough to get the bubbles out. You're not trying to actually sand into the polyurethane. Then I wiped it off with a dry paper towel and I put the second coat on. I used 3 coats overall before going on to the wipe-on polyurethane. So just like with the brush-on polyurethane, you'll want to sand down the previous coat with 400 grit or something extra fine. Get all the bubbles out, and then this is the wipe-on polyurethane. So this can be poured directly on the surface and then just wiped in. I'm using a cheesecloth here, but really any soft non-shedding material will be fine for this. Here's a look after I applied the coat, and the wipe-on polyurethane works so well for getting an extra smooth finish. So I painted the base of this white using the HomeRite Super Finish Max paint sprayer. Now when I went to go edit this footage, it turns out that I deleted what I recorded. So here's an older video of me painting a different bench in the same manner. If you notice that the supports on this bench are a little bit different, that's why. But anyway, just pretend that this base is the new base that I'm using and that this is not old footage. And now that that's out of the way, let's time travel back to real time in this video. So after I was finished painting, all that I needed left to do was to put the top on. So now normally I will use Z-clips to attach the top to a base. This time around I wanted to use these expansion brackets instead, really for no reason other than just I wanted to do something differently. So the expansion bracket has 2 different slots. One will go into the base and then one on the top. These allow for wood expansion both of the base and of the top. So take note of the orientation of the brackets here whenever I straighten them up. This way the top boards and the base itself can both expand across the grain, which will prevent any structural issues as the wood expands and contracts with seasonal movement. So when I had the top centered in place on the base of the bench, I clamped it down with some soft towels to keep from scratching the surface up. This would keep the top in place when I put the screws into the expansion brackets into the tabletop. So I just flipped this over, which would give me access to the underside of the table. And then I could put the screws in to hold everything in place. Pretty obvious statement here, but make sure that the screws are not too long to go through the top unless you're making this table for your enemy or an arch nemesis. But then again, karma would probably come back to get you. So I would recommend just making sure that the screws are not too long to go through the top. The top of this table was just under 1.5 inches, so I used 1-inch screws and there was plenty of room for the screws to not come through the top. So with the screws secured in the expansion brackets into the top of this bench, that would put everything into place and the bench was finally finished up. Here are some pictures and some final shots of what the bench looked like. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to let me know, leave me a thumbs up, drop a comment, let me know what you think of this build. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay tuned for more.